Well, morning everyone. My name's Paul Roberts. I work for StreetGames. I've worked for StreetGames for about 10 years now, and before that I was working across communities in Newport, not far from those who listened to Liam this morning on the call. I ran a program called Positive Futures, and in fact, my entire career I've been working with sport and how sport can improve the lives of young people in our most underserved communities. So the session for today, just a few housekeeping rules, if that's okay. We're going to give opportunities for breakout sessions. Claire and I will just present a few findings, and in between the slides, or after a group of the slides, we'll give people the opportunity to go off and have some reflections and discussions. So there'll be plenty of time for that. So if people can keep themselves muted, that would be much appreciated. If you've got any questions or comments or observations, feel free to keep the chat live. We'd love to see the comments coming through. So it'd be brilliant to keep that interactive. So just to kind of kick us off from where we've got to with this workshop, obviously the last 12, 15 months has been a really tough time for everyone. And Mark, I heard him say it this morning off the back of Alison, COVID-19, everyone's been in the same storm, but no one's been in the same boat. And what we are really keen to do as an organisation is understand COVID-19, understand the impacts it has on poverty in our poorest communities and poorest families. But it's really important for us as well as an organisation, and particularly with the partners that we work with, and is to understand, like, what does this mean for sport? So when we're coming out of this, what is it going to mean to young people? What does it mean in terms of the role that sport can play on the wider disadvantage that it's presenting to children, young people and their families and the communities they live in? So we're going to go through I guess we're going to break this up into a series of topics really, that will try and unpick all of the areas around COVID-19, what it means to our poorest households and families and communities, and then what we need to be thinking about when it comes to sport and physical activity. Have you got anything else to add to that, Claire?
No, that's a really good introduction. Just, I guess, to introduce myself, as we're doing a bit of a double team today. Yeah. So my name is Claire. I lead the work that we do in Wales at the moment, but I've been at StreetGames for about 9 years. Similar to Paul, their background in kind of sport, youth work, bit of education thrown in there as well. And I'm quite excited actually about this session today, because it's based on a piece of insight that we wrote in Wales, but we've obviously made it UK-wide for the session today. So yeah, looking forward to hearing what you guys have all got to say and what you think about it and how it will translate into what's going on locally for you as well.
Okay, so just a bit of a bit more indication of what we're going to cover. So we've got some insight and data around the thinking of the impact of COVID-19. It's UK-wide data, so if your colleagues from across the UK will be able to share it, and it is relevant. Sometimes we might talk about English-specific statistics, and sometimes we might talk about Welsh-specific statistics. So it's an informative session which will give a bit of an insight into the thinking around the impact that the pandemic has had on young people and their communities. We share some of our thoughts on what we think this means for sport and physical activity. Now, this is the bit really that prompted us to come up with this sort of, the initial report, and then generate a workshop off the back of it, because we believe it's really important that we understand what the pandemic can mean to sport, physical activity, and what we all need to start thinking about as practitioners, as maybe as funders, as people who care about young people and communities being active. And then we're going to provide as much space as we can for you to discuss any wider opportunities. So this is all initial thinking. So if there is further thinking, it's really great that you can connect and talk either through the chat or in your breakout rooms and share that further. So I think it would probably help that we Alison did a really brilliant introduction in the plenary session around like what we mean by poverty. So it's a tough one to follow, but I think she summarised it really well. It's, you know, what we mean by poverty is households and families that don't have enough to live by the necessary basic needs. And what we mean by that is, you know, food, shelter, clothing, or anything else, activities that is deemed as a reasonable ask within communities that they live within. Typically, the way that poverty is measured, each year the government sets out a survey of income poverty across the UK, and they call it household below average income. So if you're a household living at 60% below the average or median income, then you're deemed the definition is relative poverty. If it's a household and they're living in 60% of the median income, but they're still living on that median income based on 2011, then they're in absolute poverty. Now, I don't like the image, but I think the image from Joseph Rowntree Foundation that you can see on the slide here gives an indication of what we mean by different levels of poverty from a household perspective. So at the top, you've got income at minimum income or standard or better. And then what that means is you're able to afford a decent standard of living. You can go on a holiday, you can pay your bills, you can rent a car, your leisure provision and activities is available to you. Income below minimum income standard, it is about we're just getting by. We could probably afford some of the basic amenities, but it is difficult to manage some of the unexpected costs that come in to day-to-day life, or unexpected events that come through. And then the next level is you're not got enough income, so you're falling substantially short of any standard of living and availability to access some of those basic needs that we talked about earlier. And there's a high chance that you're not going to be able to meet needs, and you're in a very vulnerable situation there as well. So it might be the working situation that family is in, the household is in, is that they're in a vulnerable position with the role. It could stop at any time. It could change their situation even further. And then the final one at the bottom is destitution, basically. So can't afford to eat, keep warm, stay dry. It's a real tough situation for the household. What's really important to note here is that families can move in and out of these situations at any time. So you don't just stay in that particular position. You can move up, you can move down, but it's a fine line in between. So that's essentially what we mean by poverty. Now, Alison did share something quite useful that was put in the link, that you can look based by your local constituency, by the End Child Poverty website, what are the levels of child poverty in your area. So we can try and share that link through the chat as we go through this session, so that if people are interested, then they can go and look at that for their local constituency. So when we're talking about young people, there's a stat that stands around, and there's 1 in 3 young people across the UK living in poverty. Now, from a numbers perspective, I think Alison shared this morning, that the number of young people moving into poverty has grown by 700,000 since 2012. So poverty isn't disappearing, it's actually getting worse. And the pandemic is predicting that actually there'll be another 200,000 young people moving into poverty as a result of the last 12, 15 months. So it's a really tough situation for our young people across the UK. And I guess that the last 12 to 15 months has presented a huge amount of vulnerability, particularly to those families that were already struggling before the pandemic, but it's hit them even harder moving throughout the pandemic. And then there's the £3.21 that you can see on your right hand side is a piece of research that's come through the Sport Industry Research Centre. And what that demonstrates is that families living in poverty have as little as £3.21 per week to spend on leisure activities. So have a think about that and just play it back to yourself. £3.21 per week to spend on leisure activities. So if you're a parent with children in your household and you want to keep them active, how are you going to do that with £3.21 per week? It's a really tough situation for families to navigate their way through. I'll move you on to now, Claire.
Thanks, Paul. So what we wanted to share today is we produced a piece of insight back in March this year of the impact that COVID-19 has had on young people living in these areas of poverty. Now, the paper that was produced is specific to Wales, but what we've done today is we've taken all of that insight, all of that learning, all of the recommendations, and we've contextualized it for a UK kind of audience. So everything that we talk about on the slides is UK based, and we'll share all of this information with you afterwards. And I'll also put a link in the chat shortly to this paper that we published in March, so that you can see it, where all of the kind of wider Wales context is in there. A lot of the recommendations, however, have come from UK conversations. So if you can just go on to the next slide, please, Paul. Thank you. We split the research into 6 key themes. So we've taken all of the data that we could find that was kind of relevant to the conversation up till March around sport and physical activity, around finances, around food, employment, mental health, and digital challenges. And we've translated this into a series of kind of things to think about for providers and for decision makers and policy makers and coaches and volunteers on the ground, just to make sure that all of this data that's really high level, what does this actually mean on a day-to-day basis when we're thinking about the activity and the sessions and the provision that we're offering on the ground. In terms of kind of what we'll go through now is we're going to take the first 3 sections. We're going to throw loads of information at you and hopefully make your head spin a little bit. Then we're going to put you out into some breakout rooms for you to discuss and to think about and talk about them. Then we'll come back and we'll do the next 3 sections. So let's get into it. And the first section is all about sport and physical activity.
Thanks, Claire. So I think one thing to just flag up at the start of this is that pre-pandemic, we already knew that sport was hard for children and young people living in underserved communities to access. There was a lot of good work going on across communities through locally trusted organisations, through national and funded organisations, and through national partners to try and close that gap and provide more opportunities for young people to be active, and not just to be active, but to actually reap all the benefits of being active through sport. So what we thought is that actually that it was really tough before the pandemic. What's it going to be like throughout the pandemic and as we come out of the pandemic? And there's clear indication. Joe Nicholas from Sport Wales shared that, you know, the gap is widening from some of their own insight, that there was the number of young people who are doing sport 3 times a week throughout the pandemic is far less than pre-pandemic. So there's a real impact it's had on young children and young people. We did our own research and insight and spoke to children and young people and listened to children and young people and worked with locally trusted organisations. 68% of the young people StreetGames spoke to told us they're doing less sport and physical activity. Now, if you look at the date, that's May 2020, so that's a year ago. I bet if we speak into children and young people as they went through the winter period, they would have been less again, because there is a lot of narrative around how the last winter lockdown affected our communities more so than the first lockdown. So there's a problem, isn't it? There's a challenge for ourselves as practitioners, as partners, that we need to understand this, and we need to try and provide more opportunities for young people. In Wales, they're saying that 14% of parents from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are saying that their children's doing no physical activity, none at all. And then according to Sport England, activity levels are falling. similarly to what Joe Nicholas has described earlier, particularly in those from lower socioeconomic groups. So what we've got to consider as a collective is that this will have an impact on many of the children and young people that we care about and the communities that they live in. You know, less activity and less opportunity for activity for these young people is really going to hurt them from their being active and playing sport perspective. We spoke to some of the locally trusted organisations, and they shared with us some really real challenges as they were starting to see eases of lockdown coming through. And they kind of fell into two places. The first bit was facilities. So many of us would have seen a lot of facilities being redesigned to endure, make sure we stick to things like social distancing. There's new rules and regulations as you're entering a building. There's different routes into a building. There's different ways that you access the facilities that perhaps you did before the pandemic. So all that stuff that people would have just walked into the facility pre-pandemic has completely changed. There's a whole new regulated system that people have to do that they never would have experienced before. Locally trusted organisations have told us that the availability just to book space in some of the community and leisure facilities is getting really hard. Leisure facilities have repurposed some of their space, being used as vaccination centres for all the right reasons. Some of the spaces being prioritised in different ways. And I guess for a lot of what our organisations and partners would have run was open access provision. Leisure facilities are really struggling to find that space for them. Likewise, within the community centres, lots of locally trusted organisations told us that community centres are being closed. Community centres are no longer a place that children and young people can go to throughout the pandemic to be active. So it's causing a really real problem in terms of space in the facilities within communities for children and young people to be active, and for our LTOs to put on provision for them. Cost, we're seeing, we know that leisure providers and other businesses that are offering space for local community organisations to hire have had an impact in terms of their own costs, but they're trying to recover. So cost is now becoming a barrier for some of those local community organisations to provide provision for children and young people. And then there's a huge amount of feedback that's coming back to us from locally trusted organisations around the social value versus income generation. So how much is it that we can do for the good of the community versus actually trying to recover our baseline or bottom line of financials? And it's a real tough balance. We recognise that. The second aspect that we've heard a lot back from our partners on, and we recognise as an organisation, is something that we define as activity know-how. So activity know-how for us is about a young person building the basic foundations, and I mean the basic foundations to be able to develop lifelong participation habits. So that might be something as simple as going into a leisure centre and knowing how to pay for a session swimming, or know how to book a hall with your friends to have a game of football or netball or badminton, whatever it is. Like those activity know-how elements build up an individual's confidence to be able to be active for life. We all have them, and we all need them to be physically active. So there is a real concern about those young people throughout the pandemic that haven't been playing any sport, and their parents have had a real confidence knock in the way that they can participate in sport and be active. And the confidence knock is very much about opportunity. They haven't had the opportunities to continue with that activity know-how that they were working really hard on developing pre-pandemic. And it's going to get even more difficult for them post-pandemic. So if you consider you were a parent, or even anyone, you were walking into a facility before the pandemic, you probably had to build a bit of confidence to go in and take your child to the local leisure centre, or to the local community centre, or to the local football club. That confidence, even as a parent, is needed. And likewise for the children or the young people themselves, they need that confidence, and that comes from activity know-how. And to have that, not there and available for them throughout the pandemic is going to have a huge impact on them and how people return post-pandemic. Simple things like, having to enter a facility wearing a face mask, doing track and trace, all of that sort of stuff will have an impact and change the way that people make decisions in terms of how they access sport and physical activity. So we really need to think about this as a collective, and we believe it's something that matters a lot to children and young people. The one thing that's worth really sharing here is if we've got young people in our communities who are doing less sport and being less active, and their families are perhaps have less confidence, and they're recognizing that their children are doing less activity, that has a massive impact on other elements of those children and young people. So we've heard about it already this morning. We'll probably go through it a bit further in this presentation, but it does have a detrimental impact on their health, their mental health, their well-being, their connectivity with their peers. So some of them will be feeling socially isolated as a result of this lack of engagement. And we really need to make sure that we take that into account and ensure that we can cut down some of these barriers collectively so that children and young people can participate and re-engage in sport physical activity, but also gain the benefits from being active. So there's just a few tips really. This is the pattern is what you'll find these slides will go through. And I think that they're kind of broken down into 4 key tips at the end. You'll have 3 on some others. So I think the first thing to just share here is that it's important that we really start to think about place. We talk about place as, this is the title of this conference, the power of place. Our challenge as a collective and as a sector is to really think about what does place need to look like now for children and young people to be active. We are going to be encouraged to participate more outdoors. We are going to be looking for different environments to participate in. But we also need to consider it in a way that children and young people and their families within their communities can do it with absolute confidence. The second thing that we need to really build our understanding on is that this level of confidence. Families and young people, they're not going to re-enter sport, or they'll struggle to re-enter sport at the same level of confidence they had pre-pandemic. That activity know-how is really, really going to take a knock for many children, young people and their families. So how is it that we can think about building the confidence back up of children and young people so that they can have that activity know-how collectively and individually? And if you're a provider of a facility or provision, building that activity know-how is also about finding different ways that you can engage with children, young people and adults and their families. So we've really got to think about what is it we can make available in a user-friendly way when restrictions do ease post-pandemic. And then the final thing that I think we believe that needs a bit of consideration is that actually the skill, the fitness levels, confidence, motivation, there's a multifaceted angle that we've got to consider a young person, or even as the parents trying to encourage their young people to engage. We've really got to consider how we can make provision as inclusive as we possibly can. There's a program that StreetGames is running in Wales at the moment around family engagement. And the reason why that program was introduced is because for many children and young people, removing barriers in the community is an absolute must. We've got to continue to make sure that they can see their community as a positive place to engage, a fun place to engage that builds their confidence. But actually, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in some of the households for children and young people. And children and young people are telling us a lot of the challenge I have is when I go home, my mum, my dad, my uncle, my grandparents, they're not sure how to be active. So the Family Engagement Project is about taking a holistic approach to how we can engage with communities and build confidence. If we have confident parents and family units with good activity know-how, hopefully that will help take the children and young people on a positive journey to engage with sport and physical activity too.
So the next bit that we're going to go through is about some of the financial pressures, and similar to some of the speakers this morning, we're just going to share again quite a few stats, things that are a little bit shocking on the screen, and then think about what this means for sport. One thing I just want to add to the sport and physical activity bit from just now is about that I guess perception of what it's like to walk into a session or a facility. For some young people and their families, it was already a scary place to go because they didn't really know what to expect or what it was going to be like. Imagine what it's like now with all the massive signs up saying no mask, no entry, you must do this, you cannot come in if you this, that and the other, physical barriers, not knowing who to talk to and not necessarily having looked it all up in advance. So just have a think about how are we reaching out to young people, to their families, to the people that are supporting them about all the things they need to know before they even enter the building to come and take part in the first place. Don't just take for granted that they'll have seen that post on social media or they'll have looked it up on the website in advance. So moving on to the financial pressures then. So there's loads and loads of statistics on here and I'm not going to read them all out for you, and hopefully actually a lot of us are already aware of some of this stuff. Some of the things just to highlight again that Alison stole our thunder a little bit this morning in sharing some of these stats, but 75% of children living in poverty in the UK are in a household with at least one working adult. So just have a think about that when we're thinking about the cost of activities and those additional things that young people might need to spend money on in order for them to take part. So the pressure of having the right trainers or the right kit, that added peer pressure of, oh, are you coming on that trip? Especially thinking now into the summer holidays and all the additional stuff that hopefully we'll be putting on. How is that being paid for? Are we thinking about where else we can get money from to do these things instead of asking for families to put their hand in their pocket as a first instance? Some of the bits on the bottom of this slide here about increases in spending throughout the pandemic and particularly throughout the lockdown. This increased more for low-income families with children during the first lockdown than any other type of household. So thinking about all of us probably on this call have seen an increase in our household bills, the increase in our food. We might have made savings elsewhere, not commuting to work, etc. But for those lower income families with children, their household spending has increased more than anybody else. Another one just to highlight here is about the impact of the universal credit uplift that is currently in place, so that additional £20 a week. If and when that gets cut later in the year, I think at the moment it's scheduled in for September, more than 6.2 million families will be adversely affected by that. So their income will drop significantly if that is the case, if that's what they're relying on. So if we think about that in the context of sport and the £3.21 that Paul shared earlier, that number is likely to be less and less as we go on, especially when those cuts come into place. And again, some of the stuff that Alison was sharing earlier on today. The numbers of people and young people living in poverty are there on the screen, and they are staggering. And we need to be considering this when we're just thinking about what does our provision look like in the community and is it actually accessible? So again, just looking at some of the recommendations that came out of the insight, we've pulled out some of the key ones. In the full report that I shared in the chat, there's more than this, but these are the ones that we kind of wanted to focus on today. So thinking about what can our activity sessions in the community be doing that bring people and support opportunities together. Now, I don't mean having all the banners up everywhere that says you can get support on your welfare here, you can speak to these people here, but subtly, what are we doing to signpost the families to the help that they might need, that they might not know about, especially thinking about the holiday activities. How can we make sure that other things are put in place? We'll talk a little bit more about food provision later as one of the ways that we can be supporting families wider. I touched on it a little bit just now, but this idea of fitting in is really important to children and young people. We knew that pre-pandemic. That's not new information, hopefully, to most of you on the call today. But how are we considering those pressures and what does that mean right now? So for some young people, they won't have seen their peers for a really long time, especially, I know schools have gone back now, but if you think about how long they were at home without that social interaction for, what they look like coming back is really important to a young person. So how can we be making sure that we're not stigmatizing around what kit do you need, what brands have you got on, thinking about how are we getting stuff to people's homes to make sure that they can take part. There was lots of great examples of street games and locally trusted organisations doing sport activity packs and getting those to households. Simple things of the donation of tennis rackets and rugby balls so that young people can just take part in their household. How are we then thinking about that in the sessions, bringing it all back together again and thinking about, so they had a tennis racket in lockdown. Let's think about what we can be doing with that in the session. Thinking again about national governing bodies. I'm not sure on the call if we've got any NGBs with us today, but I'm sure all of you work in partnership with them. How can we be making sure that those children that we're talking about here, the young people that we really care about in those communities, really can access that sporting pathway and build those social connections? So not just talking about taking part as a participant and hopefully on a talent pathway, but thinking about how accessible is the volunteer pathway? How can they become an official in that sport? What is the access like, to spectator opportunities? So we heard earlier in the plenary session from County and the Community, they do fantastic work with their actual football squad and getting the tickets accessible to the participants that come to their community outreach sessions. For that young person, going and watching that live sport is an incredible experience in itself, but one that they might not be able to afford as a family. So how are we building those links locally? And at risk of repeating what everybody else has already said today, collaboration is key in this space about how are we making sure that young people really can access things regardless of where they live, and who are we working with locally? And it might not be those traditional sport partners. We've already heard today about linking in with housing associations, with food banks, with facility providers. Who are you talking to locally to make it a real local asset-based approach?
Okay, so this last section, I guess, of the first half, if you like, of this workshop is around something I think that's been well documented and talked about over the last year. For those of you who've been paying attention to this, it's been well put out there in the news. Marcus Rashford and other stars are getting behind the impact that the pandemic is having on those children that are going hungry as a result of not accessing their free school meals. And I think what it has done is it's uncovered more and more challenges for families and children and young people as a result of the pandemic. There's a few things I think to flag up here, and Alison touched on it in her talk this morning, is I guess just to set the scene. In Wales last year, there were just over 85,000 children eligible for free school meals. But Alison mentioned something this morning that about two in five children who are living in households in poverty are not eligible for free school meals. So when you look at that from a stat in Wales, they think there's about 70,000 more children in Wales living below the poverty line that are not eligible for free school meals. And to give you an indication, there's 600,000 children that live in Wales. So that's a large percentage, over 10% of children who are eligible but aren't getting it. In England, there's just over 1.7 children that are eligible for free school meals, and that's an increase since 2020 of 3.5%. And since the pandemic, they're now predicting that there's just over 300,000 young people that have now become eligible for free school meals. So the pandemic has caused a huge challenge for families, and it's highlighted and magnified some proper problems for children who are going hungry as a result of the pandemic. One thing that's worth flagging up, I think, with the free school meals, and Alison did touch on this morning, is that it is a measure, but it's not always the best measure for us with children and young people. We know that there are families that don't claim free school meals for their children. And that's down to a number of reasons. It could be down to stigma. It could be down to their status. We're aware of some refugee asylum seeker families that just don't know what to say when they're claiming for free school meals. It's really tough for families who aren't claiming for free school meals. So there's an indication, but actually it's not giving us the true picture. What you could actually argue is that the picture's worse, because those that are claiming the free school meals are claiming them, and those who aren't, it's hard for them as well. The other bit that I think that causes a challenge for families who don't claim free school meals is because of their complicated and more often than not, if they can't help it, their status of employment. So for example, I'm aware of a family, single parent mother, who was claiming free school meals, but because of her change of employment, she was just bordering on the threshold line. She ended up £300 in debt to the school. So the school had to bill her for £300 because while she moved on in her employment status, but still needed the support, she was a family of a working household that needed free school meals, but actually wasn't entitled. So she was billed with £300. Now that causes real issues with a lot of families in terms of claiming free school meals. Just moving on slightly, I guess, from the full picture of what it means within our communities is, throughout the pandemic, the year of the pandemic, over 2.5 million emergency food parcels distributed to people in crisis. That's a 33% increase from the year before. And nearly 1 million of them went to children, nearly 1 million of them. And then 1 in 12 households in the UK and we're experiencing low to very seriously low levels of food security. So you talk about Maslow's hierarchies of need, food, shelter, water, there is some real issues. 1 in 12 of families that were really struggling to find food to put on the table. So again, there's some things that we all need to think about, and 3 ways that we've kind of categorized this is, what is it we can think about through sport and physical activity as providers, how we can help tackle food poverty with the tool that we have as sport, physical activity. What is it we could be doing more of, sometimes at ease or even with greater effort, to ensure that children and young people can experience this sport, but also what is it we can do to feed them? What resources have we got that are available to us, through some of the professional clubs? There are catering facilities within it. What is it we could be doing more of to ensure that children and young people can have meals whilst also creating our activity of offer? The second thing that may want to be taken as a consideration is we call them bolt-ons. I mean, StreetGames has a program called Fit and Fed. Fit is getting kids active, and that's the core of what we want to do as an organisation, ensuring that children and young people can access sport, physical activity, but let's feed them at the same time. So how could we bolt on snacks, maybe a meal where we can, and create a space that children and young people can access food while still engaging with their peers in a healthy environment? And then the final bit, again, Claire's mentioned it already, is about it's more about collaboration. So how can we work better together to tackle this wicked issue really around children going hungry? What is it we've got as a collective that we could be doing better with? That if sport is our primary focus, we will be able to get children active, but also by giving them the benefit of having some food or a meal at the same time.
Brilliant. So Paul and I have been talking for way too long. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put you out into some breakout rooms for roughly 10 minutes. So not really very long at all. And we want you to discuss, what have you heard so far about the 3 topics? So what does this mean to you in your role? What conversations can you take away and have next? And what things can you do now? So I've tried to mix people up. I'm not sure of where people are in the country and everyone's organisation, but you'll be in a room of either 5 or 6 people, 10 minutes. introduce yourselves, but don't spend your whole 10 minutes talking about your organisation. Let's have conversations about what we've heard already. You should get an option to just go. If you don't, stay put and I will move you in a second. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. The latest stats around employability are that more than 60% of payroll employees have lost their jobs since February 2020 are under 25. So of all of the people that have lost their job in the last, just over a year, 60% of them were under 25. So when you think about the young people that we try and work with and that we're directing our kind of efforts and programs at, that's a huge statistic that we need to be thinking about. And when we get to the recommendations in a second, just thinking about, as a sports sector, what can we be doing about that and sharing that? There was a recent report that's come out from the Prince's Trust that I'll try and share the link, but we will share stuff afterwards as well. This is a really recent one. 40% of young people that are not currently in employment, education or training say that they can't see an end to their unemployment currently. And 65% of them agree that the longer they are jobless, the worse they feel about themselves. So we will talk about mental health in a second, but there's crossovers on all of these. And just thinking about that young person right now that isn't in a job, what again can we be doing to support them, to develop the skills, give them volunteering opportunities, or even provide them with an employment opportunity? There's lots of other stats on there. I don't really want to go through each of them. We'll share this afterwards. But one of the bits that I just want to share, well, there's kind of two boxes around being unemployed as a young person. Statistically, it raises the probability of that person then being unemployed later in life. So the more that we can be doing now to help that young person into the world of employment, the better for their life chances. And the reducing future employment opportunities are disproportionately affecting young people because they're entering the market now with limited or zero work experience. And if you think about it, I'm sure many people on this call have been involved in recruitment in their careers. And how many times have we given that excuse? Oh, sorry, the job's not quite for you. You haven't got enough experience. What can we be doing as a sector right now to stop that and to give young people the experience, hopefully, to help them into employment as we go on? Paul, is there anything you want to add on the stats before we move
on? No, nothing on the stats. I'll save it for the next slide, I guess.
Perfect.
So I guess this is what the invitation really of what is it we can think about. So I'll start off with sharing that I know it's not just me. I'm sure there are many others on this call, and also those who are not on this call, who would share the same belief that those harsh statistics that young people around employment have had to face as a result of the pandemic is really tough. And then if you couple that with the harsh statistics of sport physical activity, and I guess Mark said it on his plenary session this morning around sport pretty much has shut down. There's a lot of jobs that have been lost through the sector. There's a belief in me in particular that young people have a role to play in rebooting sport back in their community, and young people will do it really well in their communities. So there must be opportunities for our young people to gain employment through the sector if the sector needs to rebuild itself, if you like, in terms of opportunities. So there's a few things to consider here, or questions to ask ourselves is, and I know that there are many partners on here that already do this, but what is it that we can consider through some of the government-backed employability programs that, like the Kickstart program that some of you may or may not be aware of, that's a government-funded program, that will give young people a meaningful re-entry point or even entry point of employment that will help develop their experience through the sector, but may also help reboot sport and those opportunities for sport and physical activity. What is it we could be doing? The second thing I think is about what is it we can be doing, is that word collaboration. What is it we could be doing as a collective so that we can consider a sector-wide approach to combating youth unemployment. Sport has a huge role to play. And in fact, sport has quite an exciting role to play for children, well, for young people in terms of entry into employment. It doesn't have to be about coaching them in the community and, you know, with a bag of balls or whatever. There are many other skills that our sector can provide young people with, whether it's through digital marketing, business, all that sort of stuff. We've got a role. The collective sector can do something to support young people. So what is it we could be doing more of? And Claire mentioned this slightly earlier, is that if it's not directly into employment, how can we provide volunteering opportunities for young people in the community so that they build the skills and even rebuild their confidence? So as Claire mentioned, that the longer they're unemployed for, their confidence is taking a huge hit. So volunteering could be a positive way to rebuild their confidence in their communities or with their partners, working and doing something positive on their patch, basically. And then the final thing is around sport mentor programs. You know, it can provide mentoring programs in communities, can provide some real nice opportunities for young people who are feeling a little bit left behind or struggling to get that entry point into employment. So what is it we can consider more of in that light?
So we're now going to shift on to talking about mental health broadly. And again, giving you some statistics and some quotes on this screen. I won't read out. So in a couple of comments in the chat, these slides absolutely will be available to you afterwards, as will the recording and everything else. So you can take all of this afterwards, but quite a lot of the reports that are coming out now, so the link that I shared to the actual insight document doesn't have a lot of this in, but the reports that are coming out now are talking about how young people are feeling. And there's been a bit of survey overload, to be honest, on young people, but some more and more stats are coming out by the week, it feels like, about how young people are feeling right now in terms of their mental health. So more than half of 16 to 25-year-olds have said their mental health has worsened since the start of the pandemic. Just over a quarter of young people said they felt unable to cope with life since lockdown measures were first introduced. And again, 56% of young people say that they always or often feel anxious. If you are not in employment, education or training as a young person, this goes up to 64%. Now, unfortunately, I don't think any of these statistics are surprising. And if you were in the opening plenary session this morning, Mark, the StreetGames chief exec, mentioned about a pandemic within a pandemic about mental health and well-being. A lot of the conversations that we've had with young people in the last sort of nearly 18 months now, they've been talking to us about how they've missed the opportunity to just talk to someone, having that trusted adult or their peer group around them. As things start to open up, that is coming back, but with social distancing measures in place, with all of the stuff we've already talked about in terms of why some activity sessions aren't yet returning, there are still some young people that are continually isolated and alone right now and aren't able to go and see their friends and socialise, etc., etc. If we just go over to the recommendations, please, Paul, on the next slide. In the insight report that we've produced, there are more recommendations than this, but we really just want to highlight one to you today. If you think about the people within your organisation that have direct contact or indirect contact actually with young people, what was their role pre-pandemic? What is their role now? And do they have the skills required to support young people in this mental health support space? If you think about the sports sector, let's just take that for a second. I know we've got a huge range of people on the call today, but when I did my level 2 netball coaching qualification many years ago, it was about how to be a netball coach, how to provide safe activities, how to manage groups, how to develop skill. It was not about the social skills and the support skills needed to support somebody else in their mental health. So are we thinking about what extra awareness sessions or CPD sessions or even qualifications do we want our staff and our volunteers to be going through so that they are comfortable supporting young people in this space, and enabling them to safely access other services where required? We're not standing here saying that all coaches or volunteers or kind of people directly in touch with young people through sport sessions need to be able to kind of provide really high level scientific medical advice on mental health, but they need to be able to be signpost to where that young person can get some help. So just have a think yourself about whatever your role is. Are the people that work in the organisation with me, next to me, alongside me, whatever your position is, are they able to support young people in a mental health space?
So this is the final segment really of I guess the piece of insight that Claire and I have been going through today. And you know, we have to talk about the digital world. The digital world has grown significantly in the past year throughout the pandemic. And what I will do through particularly with these next two slides is share both sides of the coin really, because in some ways it's working really well, but in other ways it's not in terms of digital engagement. Now, I'm not proposing reading out all of these stats because you can see them here, but I think the thing to highlight is the words without access. If you scan the screen, you can see that there are a lot of children and young people without access. And whilst the digital online engagement has grown for many over the last 15 months or so, it's been a real big challenge for many families and children in our communities. I've heard many stories of organisations that are rallying together to find digital devices so that households who can't afford more than one digital device can ensure that their children can actually engage with online learning whilst schools went into lockdown. So there's a lot of challenge that our communities and families have faced over the last year. I think the one the stark stat, if I am going to pick one out, is that one in the top left. If you're in a low-income household, only 50% of them have access to internet access, when 99% of other households of an income above 40,000 or more do have access to internet. That's an immediate hard barrier for children and young people to engage with. So we need to think, I guess we've had to think about our delivery and engagement with children and young people over the past 15 months. And it has worked well for some of our organisations. Some of the organisations we work with say, actually, yeah, it has worked well. It's extended our reach to children and young people. We've engaged with more young people more regularly, and actually we've engaged with more new young people that are coming to our provision and gain a relationship with our organisation. And that's brilliant to hear. So it gives us a thought around some recommendations really, that if I start on, I guess, on the top, on the right hand side, where we talk about, where I just use that example of some organizations have had real good success. What is it we can learn from those organizations? What is it we can find out that perhaps is happening for those organizations to allow children and young people to engage online? And maybe how do we use that online engagement as a point to rebuild confidence of children and young people when they're participating back into sport? The very first segment we talked about was people lacking confidence. Now, actually, building confidence in the comfort of their own home might be the thing that we need to consider. But we also need to consider the other side of the coin. As I said at the start of this section, is that there are young people that are telling us that actually they don't get the same social interaction as a result of engaging online. They don't get to talk properly to their friends. And I'm sure we can all relate to this. If we were all in a room or in a building together and we could have a cup of tea and a biscuit, the quality of conversation and I guess engagement that we all build is far better. It always is. The other thing that we need to consider is that as a result of the pandemic and the move to a more digital world, we are seeing more organizations, particularly through sport, embrace it and introduce more online booking systems. And I get that and totally get it. But actually, what does that mean? If we start to introduce more online booking systems, does that become a barrier for children and young people and their families that we're working with? And we're working with because we care about accessing them and having access to sport and physical activity. And then the other thing that is a real thing to consider here is about, if we are going to consider digital engagement as something that we move forward to in the future, recognition that young people don't have the same level or benefits of accessing the correct equipment to engage with digital activities. So what is it we need to consider to make sure that the digital setup isn't a barrier for those children and young people to be active?
Brilliant. So we're mindful of time, so we're going to get you back out into breakout rooms again. Exactly the same. So I think you should be in a different room. You might be with some of the same people. I don't know. We'll hope that you all manage to get off somewhere. But again, just thinking about what have you heard now against employment, mental health, and the digital challenges. What does this mean? What conversations can you have? What actions can you take? And kind of share some things in your group of maybe what has or what hasn't worked for you. Slightly bigger groups because we've had a couple of people that needed to leave at 12:30. So hopefully you'll all get an option to go now. We'll have about 7 minutes and then we'll come back together for the final bits. So here we go.